have anything they want to talk about, or should we just sort of post updates? Martin, I know maybe you want to talk about the final update to the attributes. Just give everyone a status update.
Sure. Should I project, or since you're projecting, do you want to just hold up the doc?
Sure. Let's see if I can find it.
Yeah, it's in the team drive. Yeah, so we've had a lot of discussions on how we define source and destination within the system. It's surprisingly complicated. And after a number of discussions, we settled on this set. It's actually a small delta over what we have today with so a few changes and then a number of additions. So at a high level, we're kind of realizing that what we really have is a relationship between a set of workloads, and services are kind of second order things relative to how we route and how we apply policies. So as a result, the biggest change from what we had previously is the notion of source.service is removed. And instead, you're expected to use source workloads and workload instances. So which correspond, the workload instances corresponds to pods, and the workloads would correspond to a deployment. And in addition, we've added, you want to scroll down a little, please?
Yeah.
So in this table, we've added source.services. Is that in this table, actually? Yeah.
No, that's down here.
Next to the yeah, okay, source.services. So because of the way the mesh runs, we can't authoritatively tell you which service a traffic comes from. It's just not a question we can answer. But we can answer which services it might come from. And if you organize your mesh correctly, or not correctly, if you organize your mesh accordingly, then that can be a singleton. You'll be told this traffic comes from this service. Otherwise, you will be told the traffic may come from any of these services, and it's just a comma-separated list of service names. It's not great, but it's the best we can do in an authoritative kind of manner. Aside from that, yeah, so there's now attributes that describe workloads in addition to workload instances. So you can now query information about kind of globally, which is the workload that generated this traffic, and where is this traffic headed to, and apply policies to that. I expect we'll be adding a few more things in there over time. But that's kind of the set. Oh, yeah. So we explicitly we started defining attributes related to clusters and for multi-cluster behavior, and decided that we don't know enough about this yet. So any attribute we define will probably be wrong. So we'll wait until we actually have multi-cluster functionality, and then we'll figure out which attributes to put. And I think Doug has started the work already to put these new attributes in place there.
Yeah, so I expect as soon as the 1.0 branch or 1.0 is available to be committed to, this code will go in and we'll have support for this. There'll be some changes a little bit around destination service and how we derive service names, et cetera, as Martin was talking about. But yeah, the code mostly exists at this point, just waiting for permission to start committing.
Yeah. Well, that's that.
Okay.
So regarding destination.container, do we know the difference between which exact container it is? Because there may be IP table rules and which container.
Have the port number.
We'll have the port information from the call, right? And that should give us the container.
That may give us, doesn't necessarily guaranteed to give us, because it's not required to declare ports for container.
Right.
And if we can't get it, we won't populate it, right? But in the cases where we can, seems useful to have that information. Unless
Oh,
you
and,
can,
and similarly, it's important to realize we need a mapping of all these things for VMs.
VMs. Yeah.
Whether so, in some cases, the mapping is null. Yeah. And I know Sri ran in comments this morning that he's wondering the fact that we have the notion of namespace in there, does that tie us too closely to Kubernetes?
for any namespace or, oh, okay.
Having namespace and those things. But I think architecturally, we're kind of committed to having everything, all stuff has a namespace. All of the resources we deal with are namespaced. So it's potentially it could be a dummy namespace for a particular deployment, but there'll be something there.
Have we decided on the naming scheme for the UIDs for pods and workloads?
Yeah, there's examples at the bottom of the doc there.
Yeah, they need to be slightly updated some, but this is the general scheme.
I think we, yeah.
Looks something like this. The workloads.
But is that enough? That's already scoped down to one cluster, right? Or
so which one is this?
Maybe
I don't even know what
the first one may have been flawed. To be consistent, at least we should probably put pod / into UID for source.
Yeah, because
This is the
VMs.
Yeah, this is the discussion we were having a little bit this morning, Martin, is like, how do we make all of our UIDs consistent?
Yeah, so Kubernetes scenarios.
And
so you want to add pod / in here?
Well, if it's a resource, it should probably have a type of resource. And also workload probably means deployment and the
So the workload itself is not going to have deployment in it. This is more abstract than the kind of thing that.
Okay. So how do you model batch jobs and like pets and stuff like that?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. A workload instance is a pod, so it's inherently tied to a cluster. A workload is mesh-wide. So it's not tied to an individual Kubernetes resource. It's a higher level concept, similar to what we do for services.
Okay.
So that's why there's no labels and namespace. There's no labels associated with a workload.
Why is that though? There are labels associated with workloads, right?
Not when they're there's too many. So if you believe a workload is a cross-cluster concern, then there's going to be multiple different deployment objects, which each have potentially conflicting sets of labels. So unless we have a good story for how to merge them or scope them or something, it's better to not show them at all right now.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think this is saying in the future we can't have that figured out. It's just that we don't know now and don't have a good story there.
Yeah.
So the individual deployment is referenced in the workload instance owner field. So that's where you see deployment.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the fact that it has Istio prefix for the UI is probably important.
And if you actually look at how things are happening today, right? We are already modeling workload to workload. Well, we may not be modeling it exactly, but that is what is actually happening, right? We have the source UID, and then
it's actually workload instance to workload instance.
Correct. Workload instance to workload. Okay. Yes. In the new nomenclature, workload instance to workload instance. But so in our new scheme of things, we want to write policies against what now? Workload to workload?
So typically it would be against a workload. I think it would be the more common. So all traffic coming from this workload do this thing.
But if workload doesn't have labels,
it just has an identity.
But then how do you like
Oh, yeah.
if there is no metadata associated with the workload, then what do you use? Like, what tools do you have to apply policy then?
You have the identity.
Just the identity.
Yeah.
So
That's
this
all.
isn't a departure from how things are working today, though, right, Mandar? We provide the pod level labels. We don't provide service level labeling or deployment level labeling.
No, but correct. But the departure is that right now we're applying in the new nomenclature workload instance to workload instance, and both those things have labels. And now we can apply policies on that label metadata. You're saying we're moving away from that workload, which does not have labels.
No, we're not. So we're not moving away from that. I'm as a replacement. So a lot of policies that we want to apply used to be on source service or destination service. Source service is going away because it's unreliable. So,
right.
Okay, so the reliable thing is either you apply the policy based on workload.name or workload.uid, which is about the same as source.service, or you use it. You apply your policies on the principal that's running the thing, or you could fall back and apply and look at the labels on the pod.
Okay.
So I think it's a kind of equivalent to what we had before. But the guarantees. I think we can be clearer about the guarantees we can make.
Right. Yeah. I think source service is that's not an issue at all. But it's just that the replacement seems different in terms of what it can offer. So again, what's our message? Right? Policies on what? Just the identities.
Yeah, I think yeah. So on the you see if you scroll back down to the set of attributes, you can apply policy you can apply policies on all of these things.
So it's destination.metadata, not workload.metadata. Okay.
So Mandar, when you speak, I hear some echo. Is there somebody else with a mic on in the same room? Or something.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that covers all that. We can certainly take some more comments. I think there's some small updates coming to the example values for each of these things based on discussions over the last couple hours. But
there is one thing worth to mention. The source.services is a comma separated list of services, and it's not an array because we don't support arrays. So that's one place where we might want to enhance our expression language and our attribute typing, so that somebody could say, right now there's no way in the expression language to say if source services contains this service, do that.
But is that something that users ever need to do?
Well, we're presenting data. I don't know. We're presenting data right now in a form that's not readily consumable by our model. So something's got to give there, right? So the only real thing you can do with this thing right now, this attribute, is report it as a unit.
There have been orthogonal requests for ability to handle string lists versus string maps and attribute types too. So.
Yeah.
There's no modeling
if this had come up 6 months ago, I'd just go in and add support for string lists.
I mean, we could. It shouldn't be. I mean, it's not that hard. I think we can do it. Actually, so okay. If we are going to add a new attribute called source.services, then it makes more sense to just add the attribute that we want to add when we have no backward compatibility concerns, and just have a string list if that's what is appropriate.
So not define it.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't defined it, so we're going to define it in a way that we think we shouldn't.
Okay, so as long as you're willing to buy a good security system for your house to defend yourself against Daniel Otero, we could do that.
Okay.
And he's a pretty tall guy, so I was just warning there.
I would like to know more.
I will off the record say that I don't think it should be there. I agree. It doesn't really provide any value.
So the idea is, well, yeah. Let's. I'll talk to you separately about this.
I have another question here. Do we have a way to model ingress and the origin IPs? And it's not yet modeled.
No.
We don't have anything for that. Yeah.
No, that's fine. Just it's better not to have a poor model then.
I thought with ingress, source IP would be the actual external IP.
It's not how it's on the wall. We don't have a way to actually get external IP.
Yeah, I mean, so for ingress right now, you get source IPs, but they don't necessarily correspond to anything, including the external IPs.
I mean, what do you mean they don't correspond? They correspond to the ingress proxy, right? Or
No, that's not always what we see. Seems to be an internal IP address that, if you look it up from inside the mesh, it appears to go to some cube system resource, but it's random.
So I mean, we should not, if we don't have an attribute, we should not set source IP for the ingress to be the IP of external IP, because it's not, and it can collide with internal IPs.
yeah, so if we don't have a deterministic, reliable source IP, we should not populate the attribute.
Yeah.
And that decision is made how? In the code, in the deployment? Because I think that is, so some of it is going to be in the code, right? Once, I think we can now preserve source IP. I don't know where that is at, but there could be 3 other proxies in front of us, and then we don't know what the user wants to write the policies on. Do they want to, so like the X forwarded for, right? Which of those things do you actually want in your source IP?
It's an origin IP really. It should not be the same thing as source IP, because it's first of all, it's a list, like you say. It's not one IP, and
right. It is going to be every, yeah. So we can keep XFF as a separate thing, and then the originator IP, if it is available, that's a whole other thing, and that's only relevant for coming outside the mesh.
Yeah.
Actually, we do have origin.ip, right? That attribute is, we don't do anything with it unless someone has removed it.
I think we removed all of the origin attributes a while back. We can add them back, but I think they're gone now.
Okay.
We should think first how to properly define them.
But we already have a name for that thing.
All right. All right. Well, let's see what the what customers demand in terms of how they want to apply policies, instead of trying to invent everything up front.
Okay. So I think, Martin, we both have some action items to update some of these values and close out the remaining questions on this doc.
Yeah.
I think this is yeah. Okay. All right, do we want to talk about the other work that's going on? I know we have gRPC, the out-of-process adapters. I think it's worth having an update on that work.
Yep.
It's worth having an update, but there is actually no update. Like I've been really busy with an update, so there is no update from my side. I think Sunny, if Sunny was here, he would give some update. I think he has some update, but
I think Sunny's been working on performance testing.
Yeah. So then it's parked pending 0.8 release essentially.
We're still targeting 1.0 for it, though, right?
Yes.
So on the more positive side, I've finished implementing the check cache, and I'm currently writing a benchmark for it. It actually does when you come into Mixer, it does a fairly small amount of work before deciding to return a response. So the amount of work that Mixer does is tiny when in cache.
Is this the cache like up at the front of dispatch or behind dispatch?
It is right at the tippy top. As soon as gRPC the check call enters, it immediately checks to see if there's a match for the set of attributes and sends a response. Nothing. Nothing else runs downstream. The APAs don't run. Nothing.
Okay.
So like I said, I'm finishing the benchmarks around that. As soon as the branch is open, I'll check that in.
And does it use the same protocol that we use between Mixer client and Mixer?
Well, effectively, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, well, it's the attributes that we are going to report to proxy as being the referenced set of attributes. That's what I use as a cache key.
As a cache key. Okay.
Yeah, so that's going to come in hopefully next week, and also the code I wrote a couple of weeks ago for the buffering on the port, which should also come in next week. And I'll see if it's worthwhile to put a cache in front of APAs to shorten their path as well.
Probably not in front of Kubernetes adapter, right? But it should be configurable for sure, yeah. I mean, there may be an API which needs to go somewhere and get something, yes.
I thought the Kubernetes adapter I thought it was still pretty expensive from what Doug was measuring.
No, I think the thing I was looking at didn't have the full closing on the dispatch, so we can look again at the trace data, but I think it's actually quite cheap in terms of, at least in terms of cycles. I don't know about memory consumption. You need to look at that too.
Well, if I put a cache in front of it, memory consumption will get worse.
Yeah.
So I guess my first task would be to actually do a precise measurement and see what the cost is.
I mean, independently, right? I would say that for Kubernetes adapter, I think cache is probably not going to help, but there may be other APIs where cache will help. So I think having the ability to deploy cache in front of APA is a feature that we want.
Yeah.
Regardless of what the exact measurements are or what our particular adapter right now.
Yeah, that's fair. It's the same issue as, in general, it's a good idea to have the cache in front of the check adapter.
Yep.
Just as a conceptual. Yeah. So the one thing we never closed on with these the APAs is do proper usage tracking of attributes. APAs tend to dirty up more attributes than the actual user config consumes, and we never really plumbed that through. So I'm hoping we can improve the situation after the new adapter model is in place. We can improve the kind of enrich the protocol a little bit so we can do better caching.
Do you want to talk about the stuff you've been doing with client-side reporting?
Yeah, I have a POC working with the Mixer from the latest master and Grafana and Prometheus, and I hand-wrote configs to supply client-side Mixer filter config, and it seems to work. So I see charts for client-side stuff that is identical to server-side, except for the faults that are manually injected. So we have the data available. I made a few patches to proxy that are waiting till master is unfrozen that allow this kind of thing. So there's a patch to get the config per route in the client side, and then there's a patch to supply per host metadata. So when the client side wants to make a request, we supply UID in addition to IP from the same API that pilot provides. That helps with the identical attributes, because without UID, we have just an IP, and that is not super reliable. So that's about it. So I'm waiting till the things get unfrozen, so I can submit the patches to API and proxy, and then I can make a PR to pilot to replicate the same config.
Cool.
So I think you can submit to API, right? Already. I mean API master.
Yeah, I think Istio API is open. I don't know about Istio proxy.
Yeah. So I have a PR merge it.
Okay.
Oh yeah, unless Martin has some new information that says even API is frozen. No.
I don't know why anything is still frozen. It's ridiculous.
Well,
I sent an email yesterday to that effect, that I think Sven agreed, and then Andy said it'll be a while until it needs to thaw.
So remaining stuff, I mean, we just need to update Prometheus metrics and Grafana dashboards. Like, I don't see much left to do there except actually pushing it to Istio.
So this is for just client-side reporting, not checks, right?
Yeah, I disabled checks for now, but it's just a Boolean there. We can enable it back. And of course, there's no caching. So there is an attribute saying which side reports or checks, but we have to decide what to do on the server side about it.
Yeah. All right, cool.
The other thing I thought I'd mention, I think I mentioned it to some people, but not in any official channel, is I started work on a proof of concept for what I'm calling Istio state metrics, which will parallel the cube state metrics. The idea here is to expose state and configuration information from Istio as metrics. So the first thing I did was look at mixer rules. So there's a metric for actions showing the instances, the match data, the rules, as well as the rules and the instances that are known in the system. So you can query and get the latest state of Mixer through metrics that are just built on querying the API server and exposing that information. So it's still really early stages. It's in my own repo. Needs some documentation, some testing, et cetera. But it's an approach I'm exploring for just a different way to get at data for debugging and understanding what's happening inside of Istio.
So I wonder if we need to consolidate, because with the Control-Z interface, you can also access, I haven't also those adapters and stuff. I just wonder how many ways we need to get to the same data.
At least 4.
Control-Z isn't pumping, the Control-Z is just displaying data that's gathered, right? It's not generating its own data and pushing it anywhere.
No, not at all.
Yeah, so this is more of like pumping data out into metrics that can be looked at sort of independently. It's like a Control-Z across the mesh, or a Control-Z for the API server, but specific to configuration objects for Istio. Anyways, I haven't spent a lot of time on it. It's just something, we can talk more in detail about it as it becomes more of a thing than just a proof of concept. But
well, but that's the thing. I'm trying to get a mental model of what's the right way to do things. Because so with Control-Z, if something misbehaves, you can connect to the individual Mixer instance and look at it and figure out, oh, it's misconfigured or something. With your stuff, be more of an auditing kind of thing, perhaps? Is that it? Or
yeah, I mean, so I think of Control-Z as being very instance specific, right? This is differences per instance. You might want to check in. Whereas the stuff I'm working on is just, what is the state of config inside of Istio, absent any sort of binary or anything that's processing it? Like, what does it look like in the API server, and what do we know about it at a given time? So then, yeah, you could go back and audit, but you could also just query directly to say, what are all the instances available of type metrics, and get a list. What are all the, but without having access to, say, queue control and being able to inspect directly, right? You can imagine these metrics being pumped out to any backend that doesn't have access to the mesh.
Okay, and I think certainly from a auditing standpoint, when something goes wrong, you can look through your state and look backwards. When did things start to change and that kind of stuff? So,
Yeah.
The other difference between the two approaches, right, is like Doug said, because it mirrors the Kubernetes state metrics. Kubernetes has a very centralized view of the configuration, and even though the actual controllers are distributed, the individual controllers always act on exactly one object. So you can actually have an equivalence, right?
yeah.
You can say that I can look at the deployment object, and there is an equivalent object, and whoever is like controlling that, and then the status on the deployment object. So their metrics have, like, how many endpoints are up, what are the states of different deployments, and things like that. So equivalent for us would be, I guess, the configuration errors, or is it active or not, or stuff like that?
Yeah, I think it would be nice to have a consistent and view of what's applied and what's not. I don't think we have any status field anywhere right now, right? So it's hard to tell
Right. We don't have
instance
status.
actually applies or not.
Yeah, we're working on that as part of the config work. We will definitely have an end-to-end status of the state of things.
Yeah, and Jason's been working on developing a metric for that kind of thing as part of the config work, and so this is sort of hoping to join into that effort.
Very cool.
Is there anything else we should talk about? Anything? Anyone out there want to talk about anything else?
I'm okay. Did we want to actually resolve source.services? Or are we just going to continue leaving it as a question?
The plan of record right now is it comes out as an array of comma separated list of strings.
Right, and someone just said that there's going to be a new type called string list.
Yeah, so that doesn't exist.
Yeah, I'm aware.
I think it's.
I mean, are you suggesting Quentin? You're asking questions. Is that leading to something, or yeah? What's the? How about you just state what you think?
I mean, as I said in the doc, I think it is of negative utility, because I think people are going to think that it's the same old source.service. And for maybe the average case, when a pod is only serving one service, it'll actually look like that. And then they'll make graphs or alerts based on that. And then all of a sudden, those graphs and alerts will be wrong when some unrelated change happens and they add a second service. And so by making it I like the sound of introducing a new type called string list, because then that makes it clear that it's still a list, even if there's only one element.
Yeah, so syntactically, if it was a list, you wouldn't be able to do some operations that you can do when it's a singleton.
Correct, which is great.
So I like the sound of that. But at the same time, I know that Otero, as you mentioned, would like to do those things that we think are not safe. So I don't know how to resolve this tension.
Well, okay, so I would prefer to have a string list type. The challenge is it needs to be done in the proxy, it needs to be done in the mixer, it needs to be done in the expression language. It's a lot at this time.
Well, I mean, maybe one answer is we say that we'll add this when string list is supported, and it won't be part of the attribute set now.
Actually, hold on a minute. If the source.services gets established by the Kubernetes adapter, right?
Yeah, it's going to be, right now, we don't have to do any work in the proxy, we just have to do it in the mixer, because that's where it's going to be derived.
Yeah, that's nice.
Well,
so we.
Okay.
And you can define the quality operator on string list and nothing else. That forces everyone to just use equality on lists.
Well, so so equality
you
on
can still
this
map it in.
Instead, you'd have like an in operator or something
Yeah,
like that.
we need an in operator to be able to operate on this thing. And again, I think that in terms of policy, we actually want to not enable, like, we don't want people to write policies on them. So
Yeah, and so
I would
argument-
say that not having interpreter for this is fine. It's just like we're not inviting people to write policies on this anyway. So
Right, that's
for
what I was saying.
telemetry, it's useful if you want to use it for telemetry something, and at that point, I guess you would do a toString of it, or you can do whatever you want.
Well, why wouldn't you use it for policies?
Yeah.
As long as you don't care, as long as you're cognizant of the fact that this is not a strong security thing, it's totally fine for a more ad hoc kind of stuff. If it's coming from this workload, this source service, it's send it to staging or this kind of stuff, right?
Well, because the problem is if you have, sorry, go ahead. No, you weren't talking. If you have multiple services on a pod, that policy that you put in place for one service is going to have a side effect of changing the other service's behavior, and you didn't expect that. Whereas if you're setting it on a workload, then you know exactly what's going to be affected. It's more explicit what's going to be affected.
That's true.
I mean, I think that metrics should match policy. Whether we decide we want it for policy or not, it's reasonable to say the same thing should apply to telemetry. But also, I wanted to ask, what is the plan? We briefly tossed around the idea that you could actually know what the source service is if you have proper tracing support in the application. And I was wondering...
But even that is not authoritative.
Authoritative in the we can trust the value sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I could put a binary in there that claims to be somebody else and then bypass
Right,
it.
but one could imagine that you check whatever the application reports against the contents of source services to authenticate it or authorize it. You could make that authenticated easily. And so the question is, assuming that we did actually get that information from the application, how would we represent that, if at all, in attributes?
Well, then, if we can authoritatively determine the source, then source.services would just contain one thing.
So you would have it be a string list of one element?
Yeah, that's the degenerate case anyway. So yeah, right. So source.services is our best guess at the service where the traffic came from. If our best guess improves in quality, you can get fewer choices. Okay, so right now I want to stay with the status quo, what we've defined. Let me look at the work that it would take to add string list, which I think would be somewhat of an improvement semantically.
But then, Martin, I think it makes sense to then not add it until there is string list, right? Just
again, there's your personal security problem I worry about. That's all.
Well, yeah, I mean,
the thing is, it's like if even operationally it's a problem, right? We are introducing an attribute of type X, and now we want to change that attribute to type Y. We have never done that before, and we shouldn't do it.
I don't know. It was if we came up with this as a string and later we change it to a string list, it would have to be source services 2 or something.
Right.
In a compatible way. Yes. Yeah. So it's undesirable. I agree. So the best choice would be if I can do the string list and an evening's worth of work, then it's not a problem, right?
Well, I mean, I don't know if that's actually solving anything, because then we still have the same question of how do you export that into metrics, and probably someone's going to convert it back into a comma-separated list, and that doesn't really improve anything on the metrics side. I mean, it helps the policy side.
Right. I mean, metrics. Yeah. For this particular scenario, I'm more worried about policy side for correctness and just not inviting people to do the wrong thing. On metrics side, I mean, you can label things whatever the hell you want anyway.
Right. Well, so that means that Istio doesn't have a problem, but Otero and I still have a problem to figure out what goes in the metrics.
Yeah, sounds like it.
So if you want to
yeah, I mean,
solution.
the other approach is to use something like a state metric to map between workload and services and do a join across them, right? If you need service level information.
I mean, my fundamental argument is that there is no service level information. There's workload level information.
Correct.
Source.services is an attribute of the workload, but you can't actually break down the data by service because that's not something that's, source.services does not provide a breakdown by service. It fundamentally doesn't.
Yeah.
By service cloud or category. Okay, well, let's leave it open. We'll continue the discussion on let me look at what it would take to do a string list, and that'll answer one part of the question, and then we can decide in the broader context.
Okay, well, unless there's anything else, I think that's it. So, thanks everyone.
All right.
See you in 2 weeks.
Yeah.